Hello everyone. I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin. Story 1. The Stalker in the Lecture Hall. When I was in college, I attended a large university with a student body of nearly 40,000 people. The campus was massive, a sprawling maze of buildings and walkways, where lecture halls were often filled to capacity, and most classes took place in rooms big enough to feel impersonal. It was during my junior year that something happened, something that still lingers in the quiet corners of my memory. I was sharing an off-campus apartment with 2 roommates at the time, and life felt relatively normal. Classes were demanding, but I enjoyed the freedom that came with college living. That fall, my schedule was fairly consistent, and in one particular class, I developed a routine of arriving early and sitting in the same spot near the back, close to the aisle where I could slip in and out without drawing attention. A few weeks into the semester, a guy started sitting next to me. I didn't think much of it at first. It wasn't unusual for people to choose similar seats each week. But what made me uncomfortable was how quickly he began speaking to me, and how often. Every time he sat down, he would strike up a conversation. His tone was invasive, his questions were personal, and he constantly made suggestive remarks. He never told me his name, but I later learned from someone else that it was Jake. He started inviting me over to his place almost every time we talked. I always declined, politely at first, then more firmly, but he didn't take the hint. He would laugh it off, pretend I was joking, and keep pressing. It only lasted about 2 weeks, but it felt like longer. Every day he showed up. He sat beside me like it was assigned, whispering comments during lectures and pulling out his phone to scroll through pictures he wanted me to see. I started arriving later just to avoid him, but somehow he always managed to find me. Finally, after I told him several times that he was making me uncomfortable, he stopped coming to class altogether. I was relieved. The days passed without seeing him in the room, and I assumed he had dropped the class or lost interest. Then I started seeing him outside the lecture hall, watching me from a distance after class, waiting near the door, pretending to be passing by. It was subtle at first, but it didn't take long for me to realize he hadn't given up. Soon after, he found me on social media. I don't know how, maybe through mutual acquaintances, or maybe he had overheard my name in class. He added me on Snapchat first. I didn't recognize the username and accepted the request, thinking it was someone else. But as soon as he sent the first message, I realized who it was. I deleted him instantly. Then came Instagram. Then text messages. I had no idea how he got my number. I never responded. Just blocked him on every platform. I thought that would be the end of it. But Jake wasn't done. He wasn't just persistent, he was unpredictable. He gave off a vibe that made me nervous, and I began to question how far he might go. One night, both of my roommates were out, one working a late shift, the other staying over at her boyfriend's place. I was alone in the apartment, curled up with a blanket, and watching a show on my laptop, when there was a knock at the door. It was around 9 o'clock. We lived on the 2nd floor of a 2-story building with outdoor walkways, kind of like a motel layout. I wasn't expecting anyone. I walked to the window beside the door and peeked through the blinds. It was Jake. My blood ran cold. I hadn't told him where I lived. I had never mentioned it, never posted anything about it online. And yet, here he was. I didn't answer. I backed away from the door, quietly slipping into my bedroom and locking the door behind me. A few moments later, I heard another knock, this time louder. He knocked again and again, more forcefully each time. Then the knocking stopped. For a moment I thought he had left. I crept back out into the living room, heart pounding. That's when I saw him crouching in front of the window, peering inside. He was leaning down, trying to get a better view past the curtain. His eyes were locked on mine when I saw him. I jumped back, panicked, and ran to my bedroom again. He started banging on the window, harder now. The glass rattled. I was terrified. I called the police. I whispered into the phone, trying to stay as quiet as possible while I described what was happening. The operator assured me officers were on their way. I didn't hear any more banging for a few minutes, so I stepped into the hallway to check again. I peered around the corner and saw Jake still outside, still watching. I darted back into the bedroom. I waited, barely breathing, until I heard voices outside. Police officers arrived and confronted him. I listened as they spoke to him, asking him to leave me alone. He agreed. They told me he wouldn't be back. I believed them. I wanted to believe them. For the next week I didn't hear anything from Jake. I started to breathe again. But peace was short-lived. About a week and a half later, I was in class when another strange incident occurred. About 10 minutes into a lecture, the speaker system crackled to life, and an announcement came through. Campus was on lockdown. No explanation. The professor locked the doors, pulled the blinds, and told us to stay low and quiet. Nobody knew what was happening. We waited for 30 minutes in complete confusion, until the lockdown was lifted and class was dismissed early. I returned to my apartment, trying not to let my mind run wild. Later that night, I found out the truth. Jake had been spotted on campus. Someone had seen him walking around, and it looked like he had a gun. He wasn't a student. He never had been. He tried entering a locked building but eventually walked off campus, only to be stopped and detained by the police. No shots were fired, and no one was harmed. But the reality of it was haunting. I couldn't help but think he had come back for me. I had reported him to the police before. I had rejected him, blocked him, ignored him. Maybe that was enough to send him over the edge. Maybe I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Either way, the timing was too eerie to ignore. I never saw Jake again after that, and I never wanted to. But the experience stayed with me. The idea that someone could weave their way into your life, unnoticed at first, and then become a presence so persistent, so invasive, is something I still have trouble wrapping my head around. Jake had watched me, followed me, tracked me down, and tried to insert himself into my world, even after I had made it clear he wasn't welcome. And while it ended without physical harm, the emotional toll it took on me was deep. I started sitting near the front of classrooms, walking home with friends, locking every door and window at night with obsessive precision. I learned to recognize that fear doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, dressed like a classmate, seated right beside you. Now, years later, I sometimes wonder what Jake wanted in the end. Was it attention? Revenge? Control? I may never know. But what I do know is that trusting your instincts is not just advice, it's survival. If something feels wrong, it probably is. I don't owe politeness to someone who disregards boundaries. I don't need to explain why I'm uncomfortable. What I learned most from that semester was this: your gut is wiser than you think, and sometimes listening to it might be the one thing that keeps you safe in the moments that matter most. Story 2. The stranger in the storage closet. During my senior year of high school, I had the privilege of being a teacher's assistant for a gym class. It was one of the best parts of my day. I'd always had a passion for sports and physical activity, and being an assistant gave me the perfect chance to both help out and participate in some of the games when there was room. The teacher I was assigned to, Mr. Robertson, had been my gym teacher in previous years, and was my favorite by far. Laid back, fair and always supportive. The gym class I assisted with was during second period, and on this particular day, we had a fun activity planned, a game of kickball. Mr. Robertson asked me to help grab the mats we used as bases from one of the storage closets at the far end of the building. The gym's storage closet wasn't connected directly to the gymnasium. It was a bit of a walk, requiring me to pass through 2 long hallways and a few unused corridors that students rarely went through. Our school was older, with its fair share of dim lighting, creaky doors, and strange architectural quirks. Still, I didn't think anything of it. I made this walk before and was used to hauling equipment using one of the flat carts designed for that purpose. When I reached the storage area, I unlocked the closet, which was barely lit, and stepped inside. The overhead light was working, but it was weak, just enough to see the shapes of shelves, gym mats, cones, and random boxes stacked high. I made my way in, humming a little to myself as I went to grab the mats from the back. As I bent down to pull one off the shelf, Something shifted in the corner of my vision. I froze. My eyes focused, and to my shock, I saw a man, slowly stepping out from behind a large stack of equipment. He wasn't dressed like a teacher, or even a student. He had long, stringy hair and wore a loose, faded t-shirt with sleeves rolled up. My body went cold. There was no logical reason for him to be there. He didn't say anything. He just stared at me. Without hesitation, I bolted out of the storage closet, leaving the door wide open behind me. Panic surged through me. But instead of running all the way back to the gym, I made a split-second decision to hide in one of the other storage rooms down the hallway. Looking back, I wish I'd run for help instead. I ducked into a nearby storage room and shut the door quietly behind me. It was pitch black inside, and I could barely make out anything except vague outlines of shelves and large objects. I moved quickly behind a tall cabinet and crouched down, doing my best to control my breathing. My heart was pounding so loud, I was afraid it might give me away. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of the storage closet door opening, followed by footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, deliberate, and growing closer. I held my breath, listening intently. Every muscle in my body tensed in fear. The steps passed the door to the room I was hiding in. For a moment it sounded like they continued down the hallway, but I wasn't certain. I took out my phone to text someone, only to realize I had no signal. The school's older architecture, with its thick walls and remote corridors, made cell reception unreliable in that part of the building. I couldn't tell how long I had been hiding, only that every second felt like a lifetime. The silence around me was heavy. I kept imagining that the man was waiting right outside the door, listening for any movement. Eventually, an announcement crackled through the intercom system. It was brief, but clear. The school was now under lockdown. That confirmed it. Someone else must have seen the man, or something had triggered the alert. I felt an odd mix of relief and dread. At least I wasn't the only one aware of his presence, but he was still out there, possibly nearby. I stayed hidden, motionless, for what felt like ages. Then I heard footsteps again. This time they were moving quickly, echoing down the hallway. They approached, and for a moment, I thought they were headed right to my room. But once again, they passed by. I waited. The minutes passed. I considered making a run for it, but every time I reached that decision, my body wouldn't move. The fear kept me anchored. Then, suddenly the footsteps returned, but slower now, more cautious. They stopped directly outside the room. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The doorknob jiggled softly, but then, nothing. More time passed. I couldn't tell if he was gone or just waiting silently, trying to trick me into coming out. Eventually, more footsteps echoed in the hallway, distinctly different this time. These were heavier, more purposeful, accompanied by a voice. I heard the door slowly open, and a beam of light cut through the darkness. A figure stood in the doorway, but this time it wasn't a man. It was a police officer. Relief swept through me like a wave. I stood up, still shaking, and stepped out from behind the cabinet. The officer calmly said they had located the suspect, and that it was safe now. He led me back down the hallway, and I rejoined the rest of the gym class, who had been locked inside the gym during the whole ordeal. After the lockdown ended, I learned more about what had happened. The man had apparently entered the building through a back door that didn't lock properly. Nobody knew who he was or why he was there. He hadn't spoken to anyone, hadn't tried to hurt anyone yet, but his behavior was erratic enough to trigger the lockdown once he was seen. Police found him hiding in another storage room. Not long after I was discovered, he was arrested without incident. But the whole event shook our school. Security measures were revised, doors were reinforced, and students were reminded to report anything suspicious, no matter how small. Even though no one was harmed, that day changed the way I moved through the school. I had always thought of it as a safe, predictable place. That illusion shattered in the dim light of a storage room, hiding from someone whose intentions I still don't fully understand. Every time I walk through a hallway alone now, I glance over my shoulder. Every time I open a closet or a storage door, I hesitate. I've since graduated and moved on, but the memory stays with me, vivid and sharp. It taught me how quickly a sense of safety can dissolve, and how important it is to listen to that quiet, instinctive voice that says, something's not right, because sometimes that voice is all you have. Story 3. The bathroom door. During the first semester of my freshman year in high school, I had a civics class as my last period of the day. Our school wasn't huge, but it wasn't small either, just average, with a mix of long hallways and older classrooms that felt worn but familiar. The class had around 20 students, and we were all seated quietly as the teacher, Mrs. Lindstrom, began going over the end-of-day announcements. The afternoon light filtered softly through the windows, and it felt like just another ordinary Thursday. Then the classroom phone rang. Mrs. Lindstrom walked over to answer it. Her face changed slightly as she listened. Then she hung up and turned to us. In a firm but calm voice, she told us the school was going into lockdown. She made it very clear, this was not a drill. Without hesitation, she walked to the door, locked it, turned out the lights, and instructed all of us to move to the back of the classroom. We did as we were told, whispering to each other in hushed tones. Confused and slightly unnerved, no one knew why we were under lockdown. Some students speculated, others sat in tense silence. As the minutes passed, the room grew quieter, the weight of uncertainty beginning to settle over us like a thick fog. We could hear the occasional creak of the old school walls, or the buzz of the overhead lights, but otherwise, the hallway outside was completely still. At one point, we heard footsteps passing by the door, steady, deliberate steps that stopped for a moment, and then moved on. That sound changed the atmosphere in the room. Whispers ceased. Eyes widened. Even Mrs. Lindstrom seemed tense. She stood close to the door, listening, her eyes darting between us and the hallway beyond. The footsteps didn't return, but their presence had made everything feel real. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a false alarm. Something had prompted a real lockdown. We remained in that dark, silent state for at least 30 more minutes. Then the classroom phone rang again. Mrs. Lindstrom picked up and nodded as she listened. When she hung up, she told us the lockdown was over. The lights came back on, and we returned to our desks, though class was nearly done for the day. As we gathered our belongings, I could tell that none of us were truly focused on anything academic. Our minds were elsewhere, trapped in the mystery of what had caused the lockdown. When the final bell rang and we were dismissed, I walked outside with a few classmates and immediately noticed several police cars with their lights still flashing, parked near the school's entrance. The air felt heavy, like the aftermath of a storm. Conversations buzzed around me, rumors, guesses, exaggerated tales. It wasn't until later that night that I learned what had really happened. My friend Robbie, whose mum worked in the school's administrative office, told me that a student had reported seeing a strange man wandering the halls. Apparently he wasn't recognized by any of the teachers or staff. He hadn't interacted with anyone directly, but his presence alone, his appearance, his behavior, was enough to raise concern. The teacher saw him briefly before he disappeared down a side hallway. The lockdown was initiated while security and local police searched the building. One of the back doors had been found ajar, and it was assumed that the man had left the school through it. Despite their efforts, they weren't able to find him on the property or identify him. That revelation sent a chill down my spine. Someone had been inside our school, walking the same halls we used every day, and he simply vanished. The next day, everything seemed oddly normal. The usual morning announcements played. Teachers acted as if things were business as usual. By third period, I had almost forgotten about the lockdown. It was a Friday, and I was looking forward to the football game that evening. During third period, which was history, I raised my hand and asked to use the bathroom. My teacher was known for being relaxed and didn't require a hall pass. I walked to the far end of the hall, toward the restrooms near the back of the school. As I stepped inside the bathroom and let the door close behind me, I immediately realized I wasn't alone. Standing right there, directly across from me, was a man I didn't recognize. He wore a winter beanie pulled low over his forehead, had long black hair, and a thin beard. He looked completely out of place, not like a teacher or maintenance worker, just wrong. We locked eyes, both startled. Then he stepped forward. I didn't wait to see what he intended. I turned and bolted out of the bathroom. running as fast as I could back to my classroom. I burst through the door, breathless, and told my teacher what had happened. She wasted no time, alerting the front office, and within minutes, the school was placed under lockdown once again. This time we were locked down for over an hour. Everyone seemed more nervous than before. It was as though the previous day's lockdown had been a prelude to something worse. Eventually we were released early from school. I learned that the man I had seen was the same one who had triggered the previous lockdown. Somehow, he had re-entered the building, unnoticed again, and had been hiding somewhere the entire time. They finally found and apprehended him that day. To this day, I have no idea what he was doing in our school. He hadn't spoken to anyone. He hadn't hurt anyone. But the fact that he had returned, that he had lingered unseen, was disturbing enough. The part that unsettles me the most is how he had remained in the building for so long without detection. It made me question how safe we really were behind locked doors. How many other places in that school were dark, unused, or forgotten, where someone could sit, waiting, listening, unnoticed. After that, the administration made changes. They added new security systems, kept entrances locked, and monitored hallways more closely. But even with those changes, I always felt a bit uneasy in certain parts of the building, especially the older sections with dim lighting and rarely used rooms. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I hadn't walked into that bathroom when I did, or if the man had reacted differently, if he hadn't been startled, but instead had tried to grab me. I don't dwell on it, but it crosses my mind now and then. I don't know what his intentions were, but I know how close I came to something potentially dangerous, and I've never forgotten that feeling. The moment when the normal world of school and friends and football games cracked open, just enough to let something strange and threatening slip through. It was a reminder that even the safest places can hold shadows. Story 4. The Man in the Closet. During my freshman year of high school, I had a civics class scheduled as the last class of the day. It was the type of class you could relax a little in. Not too intense, especially with a teacher like Mrs. Lindstrom, who had a calm demeanor and a steady rhythm in her teaching. Our school wasn't particularly large, but it had its fair share of narrow halls, dim corners, and classrooms that felt tucked away. This day started just like any other. The air outside was cool, and students were already talking about plans for the weekend. Inside our classroom, we were listening to the usual end-of-day announcements when, suddenly, the classroom phone rang. It wasn't the kind of phone call that came every day, and we all grew quiet as Mrs. Lindstrom answered. After a brief exchange, she turned around, her expression more serious than I'd ever seen. In a clear voice, she told us that the school was going into lockdown. She emphasized that it wasn't a drill. The words struck like a silent thunderclap. She moved quickly to lock the door, turn off the lights, and instruct all of us to move to the back of the classroom. The room was small, and 20 students suddenly huddled in the rear corner created an uncomfortable, tense closeness. Everyone whispered anxiously, casting glances at the windows, the door, and at one another. No one knew what was happening. No one dared ask out loud. We simply waited in darkness, pressed together in a silence that seemed to grow louder with every passing second. The air became heavier as the minutes dragged on. We all sat on the floor, the soft rustling of jackets and the occasional nervous cough the only interruptions in an otherwise frozen stillness. At one point, we heard footsteps echoing in the hallway beyond the classroom. That sound shifted the atmosphere from curiosity to fear. We couldn't see who it was. A teacher? A student? Someone else? The footsteps were deliberate, slow, and they passed our door without stopping. We didn't speak after that. Even the whispers faded into nothing. Time became difficult to measure in the dark, but it must have been nearly an hour before the lockdown was lifted. The lights came back on, and we returned to our desks, though no one really resumed learning. We just sat there rattled until the final bell released us. When we exited the building, the scene outside was surreal. Police cars lined the perimeter of the school. Flashing lights reflected off windows and painted eerie patterns across the pavement. Everyone seemed to be talking at once, students trying to piece together what had happened. Rumors flew faster than facts. Some said it was a false alarm, others said someone had brought a weapon. The truth came later that evening when my friend Robbie, whose mother worked in the school's front office, told me the real story. A student had seen a strange man wandering the halls, someone no one recognized, and who didn't appear to belong. Staff had confirmed he wasn't a parent, substitute, or visitor. When security tried to locate him, he disappeared, and one of the rear exits was found ajar. Apparently they believed the man had left the building, though they couldn't be entirely certain. That was the scariest part. He could have still been inside. But the search turned up nothing. For the rest of the evening, I couldn't shake the thought of that unknown figure walking the same halls I walked every day, blending into the spaces that should have felt safe. The next day at school, things seemed normal. Too normal. Teachers didn't bring it up. Students moved through their classes with an odd stiffness, as if trying to pretend nothing had happened. I didn't expect anything unusual. I was just trying to focus on my classes and push away the lingering fear. Then third period came, and I had to use the restroom. My third period was history class, and the teacher was laid back, often letting us leave the room without much question. I walked down to the restrooms located at the end of one of the older hallways in the school, the same hallway where the strange man had last been seen. I wasn't thinking about that in the moment, though. I pushed open the bathroom door, stepped inside, and instantly froze. A man I didn't recognize stood by the sinks. He was older than a student, wearing a winter hat pulled low and a faded jacket. He had long, scruffy hair and a small beard. Our eyes locked, both of us equally startled, and then, without a word, he moved toward me. I didn't wait. I turned and sprinted back toward my classroom, my shoes pounding against the tiled floor. I flung open the door and breathlessly explained what I had seen. Within seconds, the school was placed under lockdown again. This time, the tension was worse. The fear was more real. We remained inside the locked classroom for over an hour. The lights stayed off, and students sat in silence, wondering what the man was doing, where he had come from, and how he had gotten back inside. I kept playing the encounter over and over in my mind. His eyes, the way he moved, how he looked surprised but then determined. I felt like I'd just narrowly escaped something very serious. Eventually, the lockdown was lifted. The man had been found and apprehended. Apparently, he had never left the school the previous day. He had somehow remained hidden overnight, likely inside a janitor's closet, or one of the lesser-used utility rooms in the older parts of the building. That revelation left everyone in shock. No one could explain how he had survived unnoticed or what his intentions had been. He hadn't said a word to anyone, hadn't attempted to hurt anyone, but his silence made it more chilling. The school administration released a carefully worded statement about improving security, but the trust we had in the safety of our school had already been cracked. For the rest of the school year, I found myself looking twice at every corner. I stopped going to the far restrooms. I chose seats closer to the door in every classroom. Even though no one was harmed, the feeling of being watched, of being hunted in a space that should have been secure, never really left. The man was eventually identified, but the school never gave students the details. We heard that he was mentally unstable and had no known connection to anyone on campus. That made it even more disturbing. It wasn't personal. It was random. It was just a matter of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and I had been seconds from being alone with him in a locked bathroom. Years later, I still remember the cold air on my skin as I stood in that bathroom doorway, frozen in place. I still remember the smell of the hallway, the buzzing of the fluorescent lights, the way my breath caught in my chest. And I remember most clearly how fragile everything felt afterward, how the routine of school, friends, and learning could be shattered by a single encounter. Sometimes the scariest moments aren't the ones filled with screams or chaos. Sometimes it's the quiet ones, the seconds before something happens. The footsteps in the hallway, the silence in a darkened room, and the way fear can live in those spaces long after the danger has passed. Story 5. The woman in the janitor's closet. For 2 years, I worked as a janitor at a high school not far from where I lived. My shifts were during the day, starting early in the morning and ending mid-afternoon, which meant I was always present during school hours. It was a job I actually preferred to my previous one. I had spent a few months working night shifts at another school, but the routine isolation of those long, empty halls at night never sat right with me. Working during the day felt safer, more structured. There were always students around, and most of my work was done during class periods. when the halls were quiet but not abandoned. The job was straightforward. Mop the floors, take out the trash, make sure everything looked clean and ready between classes. I found a rhythm to it. One day, toward the end of the first period, I was in the west wing of the school, finishing up a round of floor mopping. It was a quiet corner, rarely used unless there was substitute classes or overflow from nearby rooms. I was almost finished with that stretch of hallway when the overhead speaker crackled to life. An announcement came over the intercom. The school was entering a lockdown. The voice was clear but calm, giving no details. I froze where I stood, the mop still in hand. I'd never been present for a real lockdown before. We had drills from time to time, but those always came with warnings, heads-up memos, and light-hearted jokes from teachers afterward. This one felt different. I wasn't a student, and I didn't have an office to report to. I wasn't even sure what the protocol was for janitors during lockdowns. My instinct was to stay out of the way and make sure I wasn't caught wandering the halls. I figured the safest place to go was the janitor's office near the front of the school, a small room near the reception desk with a window and a sturdy lock. But first I needed to put my mop and supplies away. The closet was just around the corner, near the end of the adjacent hallway. I quickly walked over, opened the door and stepped inside. That's when I saw her. At first it didn't register, just a shape in the dim back corner of the supply closet. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was a woman. She wasn't wearing staff clothes, and she definitely wasn't a student. Her posture was odd, rigid, alert, as if she'd been waiting. She had dark hair tied back messily, and she clutched something in her hand. I couldn't tell what it was, but it looked heavy. For a second, we both stood frozen. I opened my mouth to ask who she was and what she was doing there, but before I could speak, she lunged toward me. She didn't say a word. She just rushed at me, raising her arm as if to strike. I stumbled backward out of the closet, the door swinging wide behind me. My instincts took over, and I ran full speed down the hallway. I heard her footsteps briefly, but then they stopped. When I reached the next hall, I turned sharply and didn't stop until I was near the front office. My breathing was ragged, and my hands were shaking. I pounded on the office doors until someone let me in. Inside were a few administrators and a security officer. They looked surprised to see me, and one of them immediately asked if I had seen a woman roaming the halls. Still catching my breath, I described her, the way she looked, the way she charged at me, the object in her hand. They exchanged tense glances, and one of them confirmed that she wasn't supposed to be there. She had somehow entered the school during the early morning hours, claiming to be a parent needing to meet with someone. She had no appointment, and gave no clear reason for being there. When staff became suspicious and attempted to question her further, she vanished into the building. That's when the lockdown was triggered. They were searching for her when I ran into her. For the next 30 minutes, I stayed locked in the office with a few others while the police were called. Every few minutes, someone would check the hallways through the narrow windows, speaking in low voices about entrances, keys, and camera feeds. Eventually, word came over the walkie-talkie that the woman had been found. She was hiding in another storage room, several hallways over, and had been taken into custody. I never found out what she was carrying, or what her intentions were. What I was told later disturbed me even more. She had apparently been attempting to abduct a student. No one knew why, or who she was targeting. She had no connection to any of the staff or parents. She had simply walked in, unnoticed, during the morning rush. After the lockdown ended, I was allowed to return to work. Though my supervisor checked in with me multiple times that day, I didn't go back to the West Wing. Another janitor covered that side of the building while I worked closer to the main offices. The rest of the day passed in a kind of mental haze. I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to being attacked, how easily she had slipped into the school, and how long she had been hiding before anyone realized something was wrong. Every time I closed my eyes that night, I saw her face in the shadows of that closet. In the days that followed, new security measures were implemented. Staff entrances were rekeyed, visitor sign-ins were more strictly enforced, and students were asked to stay alert and report anything unusual. But even with the added precautions, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I'd worked in schools for years and always believed they were places of structure and safety. That belief had been shaken. Now I saw every quiet corner, every unlit hallway, and every cracked door with new caution. The familiarity of my routine had been broken, replaced by a quiet paranoia that lingered long after the headlines faded. To this day, I don't know what would have happened if I had arrived at that closet a few minutes later, or if I hadn't seen her before stepping inside. I've learned that real danger doesn't always announce itself with noise or drama. Sometimes it waits silently behind a door, in a dark room, in a space that feels too ordinary to question. And sometimes, the only thing separating you from that danger is a second of instinct, a moment of clarity, or the simple act of turning and running before it's too late. Story 6. The classmate who wasn't. It was during my senior year of high school, when a student named Michael transferred into our class. He seemed ordinary, quiet, polite, and maybe a little shy, but nothing that raised suspicion. He didn't stand out in any particular way. Over time we talked more and even became friendly, especially because we shared 2 classes. We'd chat before class about sports or whatever was happening at school that week. And since I considered myself a sociable person, it wasn't unusual for me to strike up conversations like that. I never thought anything of it. In fact, I welcomed the casual familiarity. There was nothing about Michael that seemed threatening. He just seemed like another student trying to get through senior year. In one of the classes we shared, we had assigned seats, and I ended up sitting next to him. Our conversations were light, mostly about assignments or upcoming games. We didn't hang out outside of school, but we had developed the kind of rapport that comes from sitting beside someone every day. Then one afternoon, when I walked into our second class of the day, I noticed that Michael wasn't there. I found it odd because he hadn't missed class before, at least not as long as I'd known him. I shrugged it off. Maybe he was sick or had an appointment. Nothing unusual. But just a few minutes into the lesson, the principal's voice came over the intercom, announcing a lockdown. Our teacher immediately took control of the situation. He locked the classroom door, shut off the lights, and told us all to move to the back corner of the room. We followed instructions, trying not to panic. We had gone through drills before, and while this one felt more serious, there was still that lingering hope it was just a precaution. But as the minutes stretched into nearly an hour, anxiety began to grow. The teacher remained near the door, silent but alert, while students whispered quietly. It was hard not to wonder what was happening outside our classroom, just beyond the door, and whether we were really safe. When the lockdown was finally lifted, no one had any answers. We returned to our desks, trying to resume the lesson, but the day felt fractured. Everyone speculated. Maybe someone had brought something dangerous. Maybe there had been a fight. I kept thinking about Michael, how he hadn't shown up that day, how quiet things had been in the hallway, how nobody seemed to know what was going on. It wasn't until the next morning that the truth came out, and what we learned sent shockwaves through the entire school. The student we all knew as Michael wasn't actually a student at all. He was a 26-year-old man who had been posing as a high school senior. He had somehow enrolled using falsified documents and had blended in seamlessly. He had attended classes, participated in assignments, and managed to avoid suspicion for weeks. No one, not even the teachers, had caught on. The school administration discovered the truth when inconsistencies in his records led to further investigation. When the truth surfaced, they initiated the lockdown and quickly removed him from the premises. I sat in disbelief as this information was shared with the student body. It didn't make sense. I had talked with this person. I had joked about sports with him, asked about homework, shared space with him for hours each week, and the whole time, he wasn't who he said he was. The idea that someone could slip so easily into our lives under false pretenses was deeply unsettling. I kept trying to remember anything he might have said or done that hinted at something being off, but there wasn't much. He acted like any other student, maybe a bit reserved, maybe slightly older looking in hindsight, but nothing glaring. The fact that he had pulled it off so convincingly made me question how many other things go unnoticed around us. What were his intentions? Why pretend to be a student? Was he running from something? Seeking something, or just trying to escape his own reality by slipping into someone else's? In the days that followed, rumors spread quickly. Some said he had a criminal past. Others claimed he was just lonely and wanted to experience school again. The truth, as far as I know, was that he had a history involving theft and drugs and had been trying to avoid certain legal obligations. But beyond that, we never got a full explanation. The school seemed eager to move past the incident. The announcement stopped. The staff avoided questions. The halls returned to their usual rhythm. But the students didn't forget. I certainly didn't. I'd look around at my classmates and wonder how many of us had spoken to him. How many had laughed at a joke or shared a textbook with someone who was pretending to belong. For me, the experience left a mark that went deeper than fear. It became a lesson in how fragile trust can be, how appearances can mask intentions, and how sometimes the most unsettling threats are the ones that don't seem like threats at all. Michael, whoever he really was, never did anything violent. He never raised his voice or made anyone uncomfortable, but the betrayal of pretending to be something you're not in a place built on familiarity and routine, that was enough to disturb all of us. It wasn't about what he did, but about what he could have done, and how easily he moved through our lives without anyone realizing the truth. I often think about how things would have turned out if someone hadn't caught the discrepancies in his records. How long would he have stayed? Would something have happened eventually? Or would he have just disappeared one day like he arrived, leaving behind a trail of quiet confusion? There's no way to know. But I do know this. Ever since that day, I've carried with me a quiet awareness, a deeper sense of presence. I pay closer attention now, not just to what people say, but to who they are beneath the surface. Because I learned, in that classroom and in the weeks that followed, that sometimes the greatest danger isn't the person shouting in the hallway. It's the one sitting quietly right beside you. Story 7. The lockdown that never made the news. It happened on a rainy Thursday in early spring, the kind of gloomy day that made the entire school feel more hushed and withdrawn. I was in my sophomore year, sitting in my 4th period English class. The windows of our classroom looked out toward the athletic field, now drenched and empty. We were working on a writing prompt when the principal's voice broke through the static of the intercom, informing us that we were going into lockdown. No explanation, no preamble, just a sharp order and the click of the speaker shutting off. Our teacher, Mr. Jacobs, acted fast. He locked the door, pulled the blinds, and instructed us to gather near the back wall in silence. The routine was familiar, but the tension in the air made it clear this wasn't a drill. As we settled into our usual lockdown position, whispers began to swirl among the students. Had there been a fight? A weapon? Maybe someone had tried to get into the school? Mr. Jacobs remained stone-faced, sitting near the door with his phone in hand, occasionally glancing at the hallway through the thin pane of glass. We waited. Minutes turned into an hour. It grew difficult to stay quiet and still. The only sounds were the dull hum of the classroom lights and the occasional creak of someone shifting their weight on the floor. No announcements followed. No updates. Just silence. A silence so complete it started to feel like a character of its own, filling the room with unseen weight. Eventually, distant footsteps echoed down the hallway, slow, heavy, deliberate. Our teacher tensed. No one dared breathe. The footsteps passed by, then paused directly outside our door. That moment stretched into what felt like an eternity. We couldn't see who it was, only the shadow of movement cast on the floor beneath the door. Then, the footsteps resumed, continuing down the hallway and fading into the distance. We remained frozen, unsure of what had just happened, or what might come next. Another 15 minutes passed before the intercom crackled again, and we were told the lockdown was over. No explanation, no apology, just back to business as usual. But we couldn't just go back. Not really. When we were finally allowed to leave for the next class, the hallway buzzed with nervous energy. Teachers exchanged quiet words. Students whispered rumors that spread like wildfire. The most persistent story was that a man had been spotted entering the school through a side door. Someone not affiliated with the school, not a parent or staff member. One of the security guards had noticed him on the 2nd floor, just wandering, before he suddenly vanished from view. A search had been launched, but the man was never found. Supposedly, the building had been cleared, and officials assumed he had left the way he came, but no one knew for sure. Later that afternoon, a few of us met in the library during study hall, trying to piece together what we'd experienced. One student said he had seen someone walking past a stairwell window, someone he didn't recognize, wearing a heavy coat, despite the warm spring weather. Another swore they heard the faint click of a door handle turning during the lockdown. I remember feeling like we were all trying to convince each other that what we experienced mattered, that it was real. But the administration was strangely quiet. No emails were sent to parents. No announcement the next morning. It was as though the event had been wiped from official memory. That silence was more unsettling than the lockdown itself. In the days that followed, more oddities emerged. One teacher confided to a student that a second-floor storage room had been found open, despite being kept locked. Nothing was taken. No signs of damage. Just a room that should have been closed now slightly ajar. Another student mentioned seeing maintenance staff checking ceiling tiles in one of the science labs, though no explanation was ever given. These little details never made the local news. They weren't confirmed, but they added to the growing sense of unease that settled over the school like a fog that wouldn't lift. Students avoided empty hallways. Doors that were usually left open stayed shut, and people stopped asking questions, as if pretending it hadn't happened made it easier to function. For me, the memory of that day stayed sharp. I replayed the footsteps outside our door, the shadow lingering too long in front of it, the way our teacher's knuckles had gone white as he gripped the edge of his desk. The whole thing had a surreal quality, like being trapped in a scene from a suspense film where nothing explodes, nothing screams, but the dread never stops building. It taught me that fear doesn't always arrive with chaos. Sometimes it creeps in quietly, settles into your ribs, and stays long after the moment has passed. I started carrying a flashlight in my backpack after that. Just a small one. I told myself it was just in case the power went out. But the truth was, I wanted something to hold onto when the lights went off. Looking back, what haunts me the most isn't the mystery of who the man was, or what he might have done. It's how quickly the entire event was swallowed by silence. No one was ever held accountable. No thorough explanation was ever provided. And yet every student in that building felt it. That thick, invisible fear that turns walls into barriers and silence into noise. We were expected to return to normal, to pick up our books and carry on like nothing had happened. But we weren't the same. The experience had left a mark on us, one the administration may have chosen to ignore, but one we carried nonetheless, quiet and constant. Even now, years later, I find myself flinching when I hear footsteps outside a closed door. I double-check the locks before I sleep. I never sit with my back to the classroom door when I visit schools. It's not paranoia. It's a learned response, one I earned in a room filled with silence, shadows, and unanswered questions. That lockdown may not have made the news, but it made its way into all of us. And sometimes, the stories that don't get told are the ones that follow you the longest. Story 8. The substitute's final day. It began like any other Monday morning, sluggish and grey, with students dragging their backpacks through the front doors and the scent of damp hallways filling the air. I was in 11th grade, and our regular biology teacher was out for the week, so we had a substitute. His name was Mr. Warren. He was older than most subs we'd seen, maybe in his mid-60s, with silver hair combed neatly back and thick glasses that constantly slipped down his nose. He was polite, quiet, and almost too reserved, as if he didn't want to make a single wrong move. At first, we chalked it up to nerves, or maybe just his style. Some substitutes barely spoke, and he seemed to be one of them. But as the week went on, something about him began to feel off. He never made eye contact. He kept his voice low, even when speaking to the entire class, and he never really taught, just handed out packets and sat at the desk, barely moving. I remember one moment when a student tried to joke with him, something harmless, and Mr. Warren didn't even smile. He just stared down at the desk and mumbled something no one could hear. After a few days, most of us stopped trying to engage with him. We finished our worksheets, kept quiet, and watched the clock. But behind that quiet atmosphere, a tension was building. A few classmates whispered that he was giving them strange looks. One girl swore he followed her with his eyes every time she walked across the room. It wasn't aggressive, just too focused. By Thursday, the atmosphere had shifted. People were uneasy. I caught him one morning staring at the wall for several minutes straight, unmoving as if in a trance. I told myself maybe he was just deep in thought, but something in my gut said otherwise. Then, that afternoon, everything came to a head. About 10 minutes into class, the principal's voice came over the speaker and ordered an immediate lockdown. The announcement was short and abrupt. Mr. Warren froze in place. I remember the look on his face, blank, not frightened, not surprised, just empty, as we all moved toward the back corner of the classroom. Following lockdown procedure, Mr. Warren didn't lock the door. He just stood there, as if the order didn't apply to him. Our class started to panic. One of the braver students, Aaron, whispered to him, urging him to lock the door, but Mr. Warren didn't respond. Aaron ended up walking to the front of the room himself and locking it. Pulling the blinds while the rest of us crouched low, Mr. Warren sat down at the teacher's desk, folded his hands, and stared at the wall again. It was the eeriest moment I've ever experienced in a classroom. While the rest of us held our breath in fear, our substitute sat there like nothing was happening, completely detached. The room was so quiet you could hear every creak in the ceiling. Every breath held just a second too long. Minutes passed. Then footsteps, heavy and slow, just outside our door. Everyone stiffened. No one dared to peek. The footsteps paused, then continued. The seconds stretched like hours. When the lockdown was finally lifted, Mr. Warren stood up wordlessly, walked to the door and opened it. The hallway was filled with whispers and questions, but he didn't react to any of it. He didn't speak to anyone. He just walked straight out, past the other classrooms, past the office, and disappeared down the hallway. That would be the last time any of us ever saw him. The next morning, our principal held an emergency assembly. He explained that Mr. Warren had been using a false identity. He hadn't been a licensed substitute in years and had no current certification. Somehow he'd gotten through the hiring system with outdated paperwork. A routine check, one that had been running in the background, flagged inconsistencies in his records, triggering further investigation. The lockdown, we were told, was precautionary while they verified his identity and ensured the school was secure. What wasn't explained, though, was why he had been allowed to continue teaching all week, or how no one noticed his behavior until it was too late. Rumors exploded after that. Some said he had a criminal background. Others swore he'd been caught in a different state trying the same stunt, but no one knew for sure. All the school confirmed was that he was gone, and no longer a threat. That was supposed to comfort us, but it didn't. Not really, because we had sat with him, spoken to him, been watched by him, and never once realized something was deeply wrong. The idea that someone could pretend their way into a place meant to protect children and teens left a bitter taste in all our mouths. Safety had always felt like a given. That week it became something fragile and uncertain. In the weeks that followed, new policies were introduced. Background checks were revised. ID verification was tightened. But the emotional fallout lingered. We looked at every new face with suspicion. We whispered about substitute teachers in the hallways. And in our class, the empty desk where Mr. Warren used to sit remained untouched for days, as if no one wanted to acknowledge it. Even now, I sometimes catch myself thinking about that moment. The silence in the room, the stillness in his eyes, the way he seemed to dissolve into the air once the lockdown ended. I wonder what he was thinking that whole time, what his real story was, and why he came to our school at all. To this day, I don't know what might have happened if that background check hadn't caught him. Maybe nothing. Maybe something we were lucky to avoid. But that uncertainty, that hovering what if, has stayed with me. Sometimes danger doesn't arrive with alarms and drama. Sometimes it slips in quietly, dressed like any other substitute, and sits with you for days before vanishing again. And when it's gone, it leaves behind a silence louder than any scream. Story 9. The locker that wasn't ours. There was nothing particularly strange about locker 1837. It sat at the far end of the C-wing hallway, near the stairwell that led to the lower gym. It was older than the others, slightly rusted around the handle, with chipped navy blue paint, and a dent near the base. Most students avoided it not because of anything sinister, but because it never seemed to open properly. The lock always stuck, and the latch required an awkward jiggle, so it remained mostly unused. assigned randomly once every few years to a student unlucky enough to get it. During my junior year, I was one of those students. At first I didn't think anything of it. A locker's a locker. But within a few days I knew something was wrong. The first time I noticed something strange was when I opened it on the third day of school and found a notebook that didn't belong to me. It was old and battered, with a cover that had clearly been soaked and dried multiple times. The pages inside were warped and stained, but what caught my attention was that it was full, filled with cramped handwriting that looked like it had been scrawled in a hurry. At first I thought someone had left it behind by accident, but when I asked around, no one claimed it. Out of curiosity, I started reading it. The entries were fragmented, written by someone who described watching students from a distance, detailing their names, routines, and even locker combinations. It was disturbing. One entry mentioned me by name, my schedule, what time I usually went to lunch, what route I took to get to biology. That's when I closed the notebook and shoved it into my backpack. I walked straight to the counselor's office, trying to explain what I had found. The counselor, a kind woman named Ms. Reed, took it seriously. She asked me to leave it with her so she could report it to the administration. I agreed, and she assured me someone would follow up. That was the last I ever saw of the notebook. A week passed, then two. No one said anything. No announcements, no warnings, just silence. When I finally asked Ms. Reed about it, she looked uncomfortable and said it had been handled. After that, I tried to ignore locker 1837. I used my backpack instead and stopped storing anything inside it, but something about it kept pulling at me. Occasionally I'd pass it in the hall and notice it cracked open, even though I hadn't touched it. A few times, other students would stop and glance at it, as if expecting something inside. One morning I arrived to find the door hanging fully open, revealing nothing but a blank interior. No books, no hooks, just an empty metal box. That same day another student told me they saw a man, someone they didn't recognize, standing in front of the locker after school. When approached, he walked away without speaking and disappeared down the stairwell. It became a quiet rumor. People started sharing stories about seeing the locker open, hearing it slam shut during class when no one was nearby, or feeling watched when walking past it. A few students claimed they'd found strange things inside: notes, old keychains, even Polaroid photos of classrooms that hadn't existed in years, but no one could prove it. Most of the time, by the time a teacher was brought over, the locker would be empty again. It was like it only revealed itself when it wanted to. Some students began saying it was haunted, others just called it cursed. But for me, it was something different, something deeply wrong that no one wanted to acknowledge. One night during a school play, while the rest of the building was crowded with parents and students, I walked past that hallway to get to the bathroom. It was mostly dark, except for a few flickering emergency lights. I froze. The figure was motionless, facing the locker with their hand on the door. I couldn't see their face, just a grey hoodie and jeans. They didn't move, didn't speak. I stood there, watching, heart pounding in my ears. After what felt like minutes, the person slowly turned their head toward me. I didn't wait to see their face. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in the auditorium, surrounded by people, the noise of the play muffling the panic in my chest. I reported it immediately, and security did a sweep. No one was found. The hallway was empty. Locker 1837 was locked. I began to think I had imagined it. Maybe the stories had gotten to me. Maybe I was projecting, but the feeling wouldn't leave. The next day I went to check the locker. It was sealed with a new padlock, different from the standard school-issued ones. I asked the office about it, and they claimed no such change had been made. They insisted the locker was no longer in use. That was the final straw. I stopped going near it altogether. I requested a new locker in a different wing. The request was granted without hesitation. Years later, I returned to the school during a reunion event. The building had been renovated slightly, with new floors and updated lighting, but the lockers were still the same. I walked the halls out of curiosity, tracing the route to my old locker. Locker 1837 was still there, but it was sealed shut. No handle, no lock, just a flat metal face with the number painted over, as if it had never been used at all. I asked one of the current teachers if that section was still active. He paused, looked at the locker, then shook his head. That one? No, we don't assign it anymore. Too many issues. I never got a clear explanation of who wrote that notebook or why it mentioned me. I don't know who the man was in the hallway, or how so many others had similar encounters without the school ever addressing it publicly. But I learned something important through that experience. Some things aren't meant to be solved. Some mysteries linger because they refuse to be categorized or explained. The locker wasn't haunted in the traditional sense. It wasn't evil or cursed. But it was a crack, an opening into something that didn't belong in a school hallway, something that watched, something that waited. And sometimes, the only way to stay safe is to simply walk away and never open that door again.